Coming back, last year I was here talking about 50 billion connected devices. And I said that by 2020 we will have 50 billion connected devices. I guess I came back a little bit earlier because I promised to come back 2020, but I'm already here this year. So I will just give you an update where I believe the industry is going and how we together now are gluing ICT together with the telecommunication world, and we're creating value for consumer, enterprises, institutions, and of course for the society. I think that if you think about a networked society, that's what we're talking about, a networked society. What is a networked society? It's a society where everything that is connected, benefit from being connected will be connected. And we envision in this world that 50 billion connections or connected devices will be in 2020. The last 20 years, we have built sort of the technologies, the broadband, the mobility around the globe. And the next 20 years, we will use them in a totally different way. And last year, I talked about the inflection point that we're into, where everything of that comes together. And it's going to impact people, enterprises, institutions, but as well, of course, our society. Yesterday, we heard a lot about new type of delivering content, HDTV, 3D, etc. All of that new ways of delivering content will be important in this network society. And we are definitely into a mental shift where we expect that there's always been a coverage. Just think about when you are in an area with no coverage these days, how fast it has moved that you are not accepting it. You're only accepting that you're online and having connectivity all the time. And I think that's the word with the network society where we envision the next 10 to 20 years. In that base, of course, one thing is important, the networks. But it's three things that enables a network society. It's the mobility, it's the broadband, and the cloud. Those three together will deliver new efficiencies, new ways of working around our globe. Let me take them one by one where we are and where we're going and what type of things I'm seeing happening in the three areas. Starting with mobility. It took 100 years to get 1 billion fixed lines. It took 20 years to 5 billion mobile subscriptions or subscribers. We envision that by 2015, it's going to be some 7 to 8 billion mobile subscriptions on Earth. For the ones that are really good in counting here, you know, it's not going to be that many people on Earth by 2015. That means there's going to be dual subscriptions, of course. But still, it's going to be a big penetration. We see today that 85% of the Earth population has mobile coverage today. And it's going to 90% by 2015. 90% of the Earth population will have mobile coverage. We see a lot of innovation on top of that mobility, people connecting. I mean, we, for example, launched recently a mobile money service based on SMS and mobility where you can remit and send money on top of that network. It will only come due to the scale and the vast coverage of mobility. That's one. So mobility will definitely be there. Huge coverage, a lot of users. The next step is, of course, broadband. Broadband is, of course, coming quickly. And today, maybe we'll have 1 billion broadband users across the world on mobile and fixed. We took 124 different surveys together with Kearney that all were directed to broadband. What are the impacts and what are the conclusions of all those 124 surveys? It was two. It was academia, of course. It was operators, consultants doing all of these surveys or reports. There were two clear conclusions. One, for every 10% of broadband penetration, you get 1% sustainable GDP. That was the conclusion. Could be a little bit different for different type of countries where you are in the penetration. But the conclusion is that broadband definitely have an impact on society and finance. The second was that for every 1,000 broadband connections, you create 80 net employments in a country. So of course, we can definitely see now with the rollouts of broadband, the clear impacts on our society of that type of technology. And of course, it is exploding, and especially mobile broadband. Mobile broadband last year, 600 million people having mobile broadband. This year, we believe it's going to go to 1 billion people having mobile broadband. Even more important, by 2016, we believe it can be up to 5 billion people having mobile broadband. So why is that important? Suddenly, with the connectivity and the broadband, we can everywhere access anything with those two pillars, because we have suddenly 5 times more people that can access the internet than we had before. And if you add then the last pillar, which is the cloud, to having services that can be delivered from the cloud in order to take down the barriers and actually doing it efficient, you can definitely transform different type of industries. It can be transforming a healthcare industry by doing remote delivery on healthcare. Seen a lot of different type of research and trials on that. It can be logistic companies doing it. It's going to be real-time application using mobility and broadband. And of course, these 3 pillars will innovate people's life, enterprises, and as well society. And I think that when we think about that together with other industries, we see clearly a huge impact of these 3 pillars. And the innovation, of course, is huge. We did a survey in the US asking people how much they believe they're going to use cloud services in the next 5 years. 70% believe they're going to use the cloud services to do a more efficient work. But again, it's not only consumers that are going to use cloud services. It's going to be enterprises that want to bring their application out to the connectivity and the broadband, mobility broadband. Not only consumers like us that want to browse weather or whatever it might be, or games. It will be clearly software house that see a totally new way of doing business by bringing it out. And again, we can also transform societies. I can take a very simple example, but a very important example. This is Anna, 13 years from Ghana. She wants to be a doctor. She is in a village that is a millennium village in Africa. In the millennium village, Ericsson, together with the operators in Africa and the Millennium Village initiative, have powered up that small village with mobility and broadband. So with the mobility and broadband and a service called PC as a service, she have all the things that she needs to actually get a full education. Because a PC as a service is putting in the cloud a PC that is actually, you maintain, you have all the software, all the applications in the cloud, and you have a dumb receiver, which is a screen only, where she can receive all the information. We have, together with the company Innovation, invented that solution. The important is that we can transform education. Suddenly, Anna can, as anybody else, get access to that information on the internet by having the 3 pillars, having the pillar of mobility, broadband, and a cloud service. And we can do it cheap and efficient. Think about how we can transform this when we have 5 billion users on that. Regardless of content, that can reach out as far as we want. That's also one of the areas where we worked together with Akamai to actually see that we can get the superior delivery of the content all the way out on the mobility, equally much as you can get on the fixed. So I will just sum it up quickly as a kickoff to this, saying that we are in a moment in this industry, together with all other industries, to changing quite quickly. And it's based on the mobility, the broadband, and the cloud. And sort of the limitation is our own imagination, what you can do with it, because with the technology, we know we're going to reach to 5 billion broadband subscribers. We know the mobility will reach out to 90% of the mobile coverage in the world in the next 5 years. It's now up to us, together with other industries, as we discussed last year, How can we take advantage of that to actually transform industries, transform different applications? And of course, here you are sitting on the most important asset, that's content. How can that content be delivered to all those in an efficient way, in a way that actually want to transform industries, society, and people? By those words, I thank you very much. For me, it's a great part to be of this Abu Dhabi Summit. And of course, we are all part of this transformation going forward. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right, a fantastic opening presentation there. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Errol Barnett, an anchor and correspondent with CNN International. We've been doing rolling coverage of the disaster in Japan today, so excuse me if I'm slightly exhausted, but it's a great panel we have for you today. The focus here elaborates on what Hans was just mentioning, upward mobility. And we want to break down the areas that, the dimensions of this new technology, its social impact, which we've seen has created waves of change here in the region, the educational implications of that, and also the political aspect of what this new technology now provides. We're going to ask the question if people's lives can be improved thanks to all of these developments. What are some of the low-cost tools you can all access? And how important is this now for not just the developed world, but for developing markets? You see, I have a fantastic panel assembled here, so let me introduce them to you from your left to right. We have Mr. Ahmed Abdul Karim Jafar, the Group Chief Operating Officer of Etisalat. Please welcome him to the panel. We'll see if I can get a deal on my wireless service afterwards. I've told the panel also, no one word or no phrase answers are permitted. The seats have been equipped with buzzers. This is the technology-savvy panel, of course. Next to him, you see Yifei Li, the country chair for Vivaki, joining us from China. Please welcome her to the panel. She's sitting next to Ms. Saad Mosni, the chairman and CEO of Mobi Group, a fantastic company originating from Kabul in Afghanistan. Please welcome him. You know already the president and CEO of Ericsson, Hans Vesterberg, and towards the further part of our panel, Christopher Vollmer is the leader of the global media and entertainment practice, Booz & Company. Please welcome him. And a man, like many people, very familiar with this panel and this event, Mr. Nicholas Zenström, the CEO and founding partner of Atomico, well known for co-founding Skype, also rounding out our panel. And I will actually begin with you, Mr. Zenström, because we are looking at a world today. Oh, by the way, if you have questions during this panel, just raise your hands. We'll kind of try and include them as the panel moves forward. But Mr. Zenström, and we'll open this up to the rest of the panel as well, the world has completely changed in just the past decade, in part thanks to video sharing sites and live video streaming, but also thanks to social networks as well. Give me your temperature check, your overview for how these technologies have developed and how they're being treated now in different parts of the world.
Sure. And it really, ties back to what Hans was talking here about before. It's all about that we have, over the last maybe 20 years or so, been building out the internet worldwide and been, over the first as a dial-up network and then subsequently as a broadband network, and now only recently we really have gotten the broadband mobile network available. But also what we see now is more and more in developing countries that these networks are available. And as these networks become available, you have a lot of innovation happening. And all this, and it's all about creating service that enables people to communicate, whether people are talking cross-country with Skype or having Skype video calls, or if they're broadcasting their messages and spreading their views through something like Twitter or Facebook and other services. And of course that has has had quite a huge impact, and I think we've obviously seen a lot of that in the recent months, how big impact that can have as well in transparency in certain places. So I think we're going to just continue to see that even more. And I think one other thing that I think is really interesting right now is that we've always associated kind of internet companies and software companies and services with Silicon Valley. And what we really see now when we're looking for companies that we're investing in, we're seeing more and more opportunities, more entrepreneurs also in emerging markets, because these guys, they have exactly the same access to information as people in Palo Alto. They're reading the same blogs, and there's, they're communicating, they're reading the same tweets, and they're tweeting and communicating with different services. So I think we're going to be more and more likely that we will see great international companies coming from the most unlikely places on the planet.
I want to elaborate on that point now with Mr. Mohseni, the CEO and chairman of the Moby Group, because where your company has flourished in a part of the world where most would think it's not possible, in Afghanistan. Talk to me about that market and how it compares, how it is now an opportunity.
Well, you have to understand Afghanistan, when we first returned to Afghanistan in 2002, there was nothing. There were no mobile phones. There was virtually no media. So for us, I mean, as far as you're concerned, old media, which is television and radio, was new media for Afghanistan. But media has flourished in the country. Now 60% of the population has access to television, or they get to watch television at some stage. 99% of the population listens to the radio. 60% of the population has a mobile phone. So the country has changed dramatically, and what media has done is, to a large extent, has facilitated social change in that country. The way they view women, the way they view the institutions, the democratic institutions. The government may be seen as very corrupt and inept, but the media actually does a great job of doing exposés, talking about corruption. It in turn puts a lot of pressure on the government to deal with corruption and so forth. So its impact has been very, very positive.
And to that end, it's been one of the factors that has allowed programs like Afghan Star to prosper and become interesting. And I think you talked to me earlier about other shows that some would view as Western being developed for the audience in Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, obviously, we take formats which have done well outside and we adapt them for Afghanistan. And I'm sure that in the future, there'll be formats from this region that will be adapted for the Western markets. But, we've taken shows like Deal or No Deal for Afghanistan, and we've adapted it. Or we have Afghan Star, which is an American Idol type of a show. But people have very similar tastes. I mean, we are very similar, whether we're in Europe or in the States or in Asia.
I want to talk about another emerging market that has many people interested, and that's China. Yifei Li with Vivaki. China is a country that has scared even the biggest tech giants. Google is one of them, who realized they could not successfully implement their business model in China because of censorship. In your view, how should that emerging market be viewed? Should people just acknowledge that it's a different reality or fight against it?
Well, obviously in China, technology is not an issue. As in other parts of the world, it's all your agenda or your key motivation is really to push the technology frontiers. But in China, even when the technology is available, it's really about government censorship and regulation. And that's what happened to Google. And when Google CMO or Chief Business Officer this morning, when he was talking about Google being pushed out of China, there was a question in the audience about that. I think, and that's exactly the challenge that the Chinese people are facing. And actually, there was a lot of internet unrest right after Google pulled out of China that actually it may be Google, because it's not kowtowing or it's not really compromising to some of the local standards. It's doing a disservice to the people who should have access to more information in the long run. So really, I think, but despite that, the local companies and the government realize that in the end of the day, technology will be moving on, will be pushing the frontiers, and there's nothing they can do. And that's why actually in the most recent, the National People's Congress, the premier, Wen Jiabao, he said at his final closing press conference that he said, we understand that you have demands. We understand that you want better education, better social welfare, and much more freedom and access to information. We understand all of that, and we will provide you that, but give us time. Right now, what China needs is stability. And this is all in light of the changes, obviously, that's taking place in
But even
Libya,
that
Egypt,
communication
and
is
all of that.
huge, isn't it? To
Yes.
even say that in so publicly.
Yes, that itself is already showing that they understand what technology is really, in the end of the day, going to bring about the changes, and there's nothing that they can do to resist that.
And we'll talk more about this. Get your questions in mind and ready as we have this discussion. I want to bring it now more locally with Mr. Ahmed, Abdul, Karim, Jafar with Etisalat. We'll talk about my personal cell phone plan later. But in many emerging markets, the infrastructure for broadband doesn't exist already. Many places, many people, their first interaction with social networking sites and the internet is through a mobile device. How is Etisalat looking at that new reality?
Yarol, it's absolutely right. Broadband infrastructure is the #1 enablers for broadband. So what we have done, if we start with the UAE, in UAE we are extending fiber to the home technology to each and every house. We have almost completed the city of Abu Dhabi, so it will be the first city where you have 100% fiber penetration. We will do about 90% of the whole country by end of this year, and 100% of the whole country by 2012. So we'll probably be the first country in the world to have 100% fiber penetration. Now, to complement that, we also rolling out LTE by middle of this year in the whole country, all the cities. In other markets, if I speak about Saudi Arabia, when we went, we started rolling out broadband. We started with 7.2 megabit per second. Now we are up to 42 megabit per second. We have 60% market share. We are investing very heavily in broadband infrastructure. In Egypt, we have more than 40% market share in data, although we are the third entrant, and we have been there only 3 years. So broadband infrastructure is the fairest and most important enabler for broadband penetration in any market.
And, you know, we talked about the political impact of all of this in the region with so many young people under the age of 30 making up the bulk of populations. We've seen revolutions take place. We've seen governments that have been in power for decades be ousted because of the movement of people facilitated by online networks. I want to bring in Christopher Vollmer now with Booz & Company, because one thing you've done recently, and this is a new study that you've just announcing the results of now, is you've looked into the mobile habits, the general habits of young people in the region. What did you find?
Well, that's right. We've just released a study about, it's particularly about news consumption in the region. And I think one of the most interesting things about it is that it's really at an inflection point in terms of its development. You know, in other markets, particularly coming out of the recession, businesses like newspapers, magazines have been hit pretty hard by changes in consumption and changes in advertising spending. Those impacts haven't come to the Gulf in the same way that they have in North America or Europe. But what was very interesting about the study is that we see that same kind of consumption trend now coming here. And there were two specific data points, I think, that really drove that home for us. And this was a study that was conducted across Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. And 76% of consumers said basically that they were going online to consume news as opposed to in traditional print formats. So big shift in consumption. And then the other finding was that only 25% of those consumers said they would go to the same brands. So effectively, they were going to new places and in new formats for information. And obviously, that has big implications for anyone in the publishing business. Clearly, there's opportunity for new companies that are able to tap into a different kind of consumption pattern, which is much more on the go, much more driven by the social community. It's not just professional content, but also user-generated content, and really, expands the possibility for consumers to access content. And I think one of the things that's enabling that, we've heard a lot about that through the course of today, has been, there is an infrastructure now that's in place. You are seeing smartphone penetration increase, and there is an overall growth in the amount of local content services becoming available. Those three things, on top of the consumption trend, we think are really going to change things in terms of what the media landscape is going to look like here. And we think you'll also benefit from having seen this movie in a way before. You can look to what's happened in the United States, look to what's happened in Europe, and kind of understand what the playbook looks like for publishers to adapt to that, whether they're going to double down on paid content like a Dow Jones or a Financial Times. Are they going to push more diversification and get into other businesses like an Axel Springer? Or are they going to really push the envelope on innovation like we heard John Miller talk about earlier today with The Daily? So we think it's a very important inflection point in where news consumption is, content consumption overall, and what it means for the region.
So Hans, what do we make of all of this? Your presentation made the point that the growth has been exponential these past few decades, which makes it seem as if what we're seeing in this next decade will be even more dramatic than what we've already experienced. One thing Chris mentioned was that developers have to make a choice now. You mentioned the cloud. Google software is available on some Ericsson phones, and there's this idea that open source technology that allows anyone to develop something and allow it to be used on a platform is the future. Meanwhile, Apple is doing exceedingly well, keeping the door closed and only allowing so much. What's your view of which is the best approach?
I don't think it's the best approach. I think they're very different, but I come back a little bit to what Niklas said. I think that the innovation is now, with the openness, of course, innovation can come from anywhere. And of course, when everybody has this connectivity and the broadband innovation, everybody will have the same information. And I think that is a very important statement, because that will change quite a lot, because people will push for it. But when I think about the application, I also think about what type of application will it be. Of course, we're going to see a lot of leisure application coming out, etc. But what I think is the biggest market is, of course, enterprise solutions that's going to be brought out on mobility and broadband, where you can transform a certain industry. If it's a healthcare, if it's logistic companies, if it's traffic management or something like that, that is really going to be when quality of service and quality of experience will be extremely important, but it will definitely transform efficiency on that particular industry. I usually say that, just imagine if you have traffic control, meaning you have enabled a device, a mobile device in the cars, you can just steer the traffic in a very urban city. That can probably take away 10 to 15% of the CO2 emission, only by steering the traffic. But it can only happen, again, if you have connectivity, broadband, and an application in the cloud. And again, all these are different industries sitting and thinking about how can we take advantage of this. And of course, there are development more to be done. So I think it's opened up so many more avenues when it's open and everybody can access it. I think but there's going to be different models.
And one of the deciding factors on which one of those models succeeds will be where are investors putting their money. Yeah. This is where I want to bring in Nicholas Zenström, well known for co-founding Skype, selling it, coming back, being on the board. We're looking at social networking sites like Facebook, which are now valued in the billions. In your view, it's your job to know what's coming next. What's next?
Well, that's the beauty of this business is you never know. But I think it's all about finding the right people, these entrepreneurs who have these big visions, and you just happen to be at the right time, at the right place with the right product and the right people, and then magic happens. And just as an example, back in 2002 when we started Skype, there was no analysts or industry experts who foresaw that internet telephony would be big using peer-to-peer technology. As a matter of fact, when Google started, all the search players, if it was Alta Vista or Yahoo, they were all changing their businesses to become portals. When Facebook started, you already had a big king, which was MySpace in social networks. So it's not always the obvious things that, you know, all these big trends, but you know, one thing it's a really, really interesting time today to look at innovation and new companies, because we have so many more people being connected. And what's really interesting right now, what you see, and we started to see that last year and even more now, is that you have so many software companies just developing all these mobile services. And just a year ago, you know, the thinking was that you had mobile extensions to web-based services. Today you see a bunch of entrepreneurs who are building mobile online services, and they say, forget about the web. Yeah. So that's going to be quite transformational. I mean, I think we're going to see a lot of established web players being disrupted by new startups. And again, this is something that can happen, you know, in a lot of different places.
And Chris Vollmer, you've looked into this younger generation. I think you've dubbed it Generation C, always connected. How can we describe not just the younger generation now, but the ones that are coming up? How will their habits change in this next decade?
Yeah, I think the always connected term is really the one that sticks with me the most. I think there was actually a study that came out pretty recently by Joan Gans-Cooney, who leads Sesame Workshop, essentially titled that same thing. And basically, it was all about how the age of digital adoption continues to get pushed down. So essentially, now it's somewhere typically between 5 and 8 that children first have a digital experience. And I think this is something, you know, Hans mentioned, I think, in his talk, his lead-in about education, that I think is one of these spaces that is ripe for transformation. And for this next generation will play a big part in how their education is actually delivered. It's referred to in Cooney's study as the pass-along effect. You see it like when a mom hands the iPhone or the iPad to the child, and the child gets to have a digital experience fairly early on. I think what we'll see is, as entrepreneurs and companies and even governments start rethinking education in particular, which is a fairly antiquated sort of content and delivery system, you'll see more and more innovation, more and more technology, both for cost and effectiveness reasons, enter into the dialogue there. And I think that next generation will essentially be a generation that experiences not just the digital revolution in news and entertainment that we've been talking about, but much more of a digital transformation in their education as well.
Chris, did you see the YouTube video of a baby playing music on an iPad?
I can say I've not seen that,
It's
but I believe it.
It absolutely underscores exactly what you're saying, that the age that people are feeling comfortable with this technology is constantly being brought down. I do want to ask Hans about some initiatives you have in the developing world. We've mentioned that in some places people access the web through mobile devices because the infrastructure isn't in the ground. This is countries like India or throughout the continent of Africa. You've got this mobile money initiative and Refugees United. What can you tell us about that?
I think that it comes back to innovation comes now because the mobility. I mean, I think that Refugees United is an excellent example of two Danish brothers that lost a friend that was a refugee, and they went to the refugee camp in Afghanistan actually and looked for him, and there was a big one, so they didn't find him. What we found out from Ericsson's side when we were raising towers close to refugee camps in other parts of the world was that up to 70 to 80% of the refugees has a mobile phone. I mean, who can imagine that? And suddenly these brothers came to Ericsson and told us, we can do an SMS sort of search between the refugees to find each other, because the biggest challenge for refugees is that you lose each other on the journey between different refugee camps. It can take up to 7-8 years before you come to a country. So they developed a service together with Ericsson where you basically log on when you come into a refugee camp, and you add in all the data, not your name and where you come from, because you don't want to tell who you are when you're in a refugee camp sometimes. So you tell them, my aunt had a a big knee or a big head or whatever, an ear. So a lot of information just, and then you match that to others, and then you find a friend or a refugee, which is, again, an innovation on top of something we never thought about, which I think is just amazing.
And of course, we know there is the multiple disasters in Japan. There are crowdsourcing crisis mapping websites like ushahidi.com, aggregates all of that information, text messages, bits of information on the web, and maps it in real time on an interactive map that helps aid agencies get to those people who need it most. Mr. Abdul Karim Jafar, one of the things Etisalat is doing is allowing people to connect to the web through mobile devices and do the same sort of thing, jump around social networking sites via text message.
Yes, today the penetration of smartphones is still very low. Now maybe in markets like UAE and Saudi Arabia, it's relatively high, but in other markets, it is low. And people do not have access to the internet from their mobile device. So we have enabled a service, which is SMS to Facebook, for example. They can communicate with their Facebook, with their colleagues on Facebook through SMS. And that has been very popular on those markets where either broadband is not available or where they don't have a smartphone. And we tested in one market, and then we have rolled it out in different markets, and we have seen a great success on this service. It's a small service, but I think the benefit to the users and closing that social community has been very important for us.
Mr. Mohseni, where do you view all of this? In your efforts you're partnering now with News Corp to develop a Persian language network and TV programming. As you develop the TV program, do you consider that people are also consuming the same content or on the web at the same time?
Well, obviously, I mean, that needs to be taken into consideration. The markets we're active in are quite extraordinary. Afghanistan's population is 60% is under the age of 20, median age of 17. Iran is, for example, 60% under the age of 30. Now, although internet penetration is not very high in Afghanistan, it's very high in Iran, it's very high in the Gulf. And just further to the comments of our friends here, there's a real disconnect between the older generation and the younger generation. The younger generation have adapted very well in this new environment. I mean, you look at the case of Egypt, the establishment opposition tried for years, for decades, to topple the government. They effectively failed. The new generation, having picked up from ideas from Serbia and so forth, were able to very quickly mobilize people very quickly. In some ways, the tail is wagging the dog, and I think that's going to be the case in Afghanistan and in some of the other countries around the region. That the younger generation will adapt very quickly. They'll get the information from different sources, and will, of course, demand more because they know what's going on around the world.
I think one aspect that really underscored that in Egypt, when the uprisings were happening in Tahrir Square, you saw a complete shutdown of the internet. You could look at the traffic that went almost to nil. The government possibly making an attempt to cut off access to social networking sites to limit the opposition, obviously didn't work. Young people still mobilized. They got around local networks and
But that's where old media also played an important role. I mean, I think that the pan-Arab news channels were also very important. It wasn't just Twitter or Facebook. You also have to look at the news channels. So it's a combination of many things that impact social change in this region.
Yifei, what about in China? We talk about this divide between the older and younger generations. It's possibly nowhere more apparent than in China, where people now are driving, they are living, you've got millions lifted out of poverty. Young people there living a much different life than their parents. How do you think that fits into how technology will facilitate change, if at all?
Well, it's very interesting in China now that people, when you meet or in a social environment, the first thing they ask you is, are you the 60s, are you the 70s, 80s, 90s? Then they know how old you are, that you're either 20 years old or you're 30 years old or 40 years old, 50 years. Then they immediately define in their mind a stereotype of what kind of consumption are you using in terms of what medium. And basically, the people of the 90s and 80s are absolutely embracing, and majority, 75%, using really new media, what we call digital media, and their behavior and their faith. Like we call them the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. We call them the old ones, the 60 to 70, is called their faith is to the country. And then in the 80s, their faith is to the family. But the 90s, their faith is to themselves. So it's really about self-expression. It's about self-belief and self-motivation and self-success. So that all is like really defining the social behavior. And three big trends that I see is that actually, first of all, content is still king. Because in China still, there's 385 million households of TV. So that's 1 billion people. So that's still 80% of the media. But obviously the pendulum is moving to new media. And this new media is because it's really, really changing the influence of the young people. Then it becomes very powerful. And then the other thing is also because the government is seeing this change, the government is now realizing they have to invest money. So the government has allocated like 400 billion just recently to build China's search engine, to counter Baidu. Even though I understand that Google is out, but Baidu is still there, and Baidu is a privately owned, it's NASDAQ listed company. So it's really building search engine, social network, people.com, Xinhua.com, they're all official news agencies, but they're launching their video sites as well. And then the other thing is that what we see is really, you see the push down, what we call is the sync phenomenon, which is really, you see that the whole digital media is transforming consumption and behavior in tier 3 and tier 4 and tier 5 cities. And that's really the huge population that was really not, influenced by, the official news before. And that's why it's beyond what the government is really now can be able to control. So that's why they're building its own digital media.
I mean, China just fascinates me in so many ways. And when we saw organized protests try to take place there, that was squashed quickly by the government. A lot of the messages and coverage, we mentioned media coverage, censored in China as well. I want to branch this out to the entire panel now. And of course, if you have questions, just raise your hand. We'll have someone run over to you with the microphone. Where in your view, and anyone can jump in, do you think we'll see the most dramatic growth within this next decade? What country is it? And what type of innovation or technology do you think we'll see? It's an easy question, come on.
Oh, I mean, I can just look at our company. I mean, we are in 175 countries. And if you look just 1 year back, I mean, the biggest growth and the quickest growth was in North America last year. So, and if we go back 2 years, it was in Africa and Middle East, it was more investment. And so I guess it's a little bit different on the cycles of where you are in both the penetration and the media consumption, but it really varies. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint one, but of course, if you look from mobile penetration, there's of course a bigger potential if you go to Africa and parts of the Middle East, where it's lower than the rest of the world, and even for broadband. So I guess from that point of view, to get the whole ecosystem up, there is still more investment to be done.
And Mrs. Zenstrom, could you elaborate on that? Because there is, as we look at developed and developing markets, Skype has different penetration in those markets.
Yeah, so I think first of all, you're always leading with infrastructure investments, which typically have very long cycles. And I think it's when you reach some kind of penetration of broadband, if it's fixed broadband and mobile broadband, that you have an opportunity to have a lot of innovation and growth on services on top of that. And so that's also what we've seen now in North America and in Europe. There's been a lot of growth on mobile services because that's where we've been seeing high penetration of smartphones. So what's interesting now is to take a place like Brazil, for example, which now started to have some kind of critical mass of broadband, still lagging behind on mobile broadband, but starting to happen. And as prices of smartphones coming down, I think you're going to see a quite steep growth on online services there. If you take a place like India, which has been lagging and not really have any good broadband at all, and we haven't seen as much innovation on kind of online services at all from India. I think that's an opportunity also in the next 5 years as they're rolling out 3G and 4G at the same time, and they're going to leapfrog the fixed broadband, and you're going to see another type of innovation.
Yeah, just to build
Go ahead.
on the discussion, not from a geographic standpoint, but I think from a business standpoint, I think we're just at the beginning at the kinds of businesses that are going to get built off of social media like Facebook. It's essentially, at enormous scale from a user standpoint, but still a very small business in terms of advertising, which is really the primary thing that's happening on Facebook. It's also a very high growth gaming platform. Just getting into shopping and local services, could potentially be a telecommunications platform at some point as well. I think there'll be a lot of other businesses that will start, grow, and expand built off of the social ecosystem, and I think we're just at the early phases of that development. But it'll be huge.
Go ahead.
Because of what's happening in the Middle East, I think the Middle East will witness probably the highest growth this year and next year because of the younger generation, because of this generation realizing the benefit of the Facebook, Twitter, and so on, and the huge investment in certain countries in broadband connectivity. But in addition to the Middle East, I think Indonesia will probably be the #1 country in the world. They are already the #1 user of Facebook. They are the #1 user of BlackBerry, in terms of smart devices. So and they have very good broadband infrastructure. Okay, the quality may not be that excellent, but they have very good coverage. And the youth is very much tech savvy, and they want to try new things all the time. And the pricing and the competition, I think, is helping that. So I think you'll see Indonesia coming up on the map very quickly.
I want to highlight some of the pitfalls of all of this, though. Mr. Vestberg, you talked about the cloud. I mean, the fact that we're moving away from hardware. We don't need our information to live on a laptop or CPU, that it will exist elsewhere. Google has pioneered the ability to gather information about how you search for something. It will make suggestions based on your habits. Facebook's advertisements are based on terms that come and go in your messages and your wall posts. There's a concept now that our privacy online has evaporated in a true sense, because you put the information out on the web. How do you know that anything is safe? Talk to me about some of the pitfalls of this future we're all entering, where everything is out there and hackable.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Of course, given the social networks coming out and usage of it is, of course, a way of doing business models on top of it. I think that all of us, of course, need to be understanding what type of terms and conditions we're going into, but still, it has such a dramatic efficiency and addition to your life, so you're prepared to actually take some further step than you normally do, because it is transforming your daily work. But I think that when it comes to, let's for example, take and just an example, SAP, for example. I mean, they probably one day would like to bring out their users on mobility and broadband. That probably is not going to be on the cloud, and in that sense, it's going to be another way. I see that is even being a bigger market over time for content provider as well. I mean, one survey, we are doing a lot of surveys to understand how we develop technology, etc. I mean, if you look at the smartphone users, I mean, 70% of the search on the network is going through an app. They don't go up and search it. They go straight to the app, because that's where they find their content. And what they do is, of course, they connect directly with the content owner. And the content owner has a direct link to the consumer, which was never the case before, because then you went up to the internet. So we need to think, I think Niklas mentioned, it will change the game when you go to smartphones, because it's not going to be equally convenient. So you're going to find more application that is directed to you, that you work with, than others.
Yeah, that concept spurred this Wired magazine front page saying the internet is dead now, because we're going to do more direct.
I think that was strong words. Yeah, very strong words.
The author agreed with that. But Mr. Zenström, what do you think? Do you believe there is such a thing in this environment we're moving into called online privacy? Or should we acknowledge that someone certainly could be watching somewhere?
I think that the privacy, online privacy has completely been redefined in the last few years, you know, with Google knowing everything we're searching for and what we have in our emails, and with Facebook knowing a lot of things what we do. But what's interesting, the two differences here is that what you search on Google and what you have in your private email, that was something that, you know, Google's algorithm could crawl and to, you know, present advertisement to you on. But with Facebook, it's all open. So I think you have this now, we're talking about this Generation C, this much younger generation been growing up with this, and they think it's a normal thing to do, to have everything on Facebook. And one day they're going to go out and they're going to get jobs, and maybe some of them are going to try to get into politics. Yeah. And then everything is there. Yeah. You know, your history, your online history is there. So things that you maybe think is pretty cool to do when you're, you know, at a party, when you're like, you know, 19 years old, maybe it's not so great when you're going to run for office later on. Yeah. So, or maybe we're going to redefine what we think is kind of politically correct or not, because, you know, a lot of times we say, oh, we are so, you know, correct, but everyone is like, you know, everyone has something that, you know, that maybe it's not, you know, politically correct to do, but, you know, you have all these politicians who've been, you know, they're finding out they did something when they were young, and maybe, you know, as these guys growing up, maybe it's all going to be open anyway. But I think that there's a lot of people, most people, 99% or whatever, they don't really consider all the privacy issues that they are facing, because convenience always wins.
And of course, in China, there's no Privacy Act, so there's no privacy. And there's no innovation, because they just take everything and copy from whatever that's invented in the world. There. So actually, it's probably, I mean, kidding aside, I think, you know, coming back to the opportunities, but like, for example, for e-commerce, and that's where technology is already there, and yet you have such a huge, massive market of consumption. And now, you know, you all see the e-commerce companies are like growing at 500% year on year. So that, you know, so innovation and technology that they borrow and they grow very quickly and, you know, take advantage. So that's another, you know, big opportunity for China.
And there's a great parenting tip here. The scariest thing you can say to your kids is that their Facebook profile lives forever, and Facebook owns those pictures. So if they're up to bad activities, remind them of that, and they'll fall in line quickly. I just want to wrap up the panel. Please let me know if you have any questions, but I want to get final thoughts from our panelists based on what's available, where the emerging markets here, your thoughts on what we'll see in this next year. I'll start with you, Mr. Abdul Karim Jafar.
Today there are 4 or 5 main players in the total ecosystem. They are the telcos, the media players, the over-the-top players, and the gaming companies. So what you will see, I think, maybe not within the next year, but definitely in 3 to 5 years' time, is convergence and consolidation. Business convergence, as well as probably company consolidation, or even. So you may see a telco acquiring a media company or the other way around. This is one way, I think, to maintain leadership position, to grow in the market, and to acquire the skills and the capability that is required for the future years. I think the telcos, they come with a very reliable network, very sound network, very good operation model, but maybe innovation is not as good as over-the-top players. Creativity maybe not as good as the gaming. So this is where I think the complement has to have. So either there will be a joint business model, or there will be a real consolidation and integration of business. This is, I think, what you will see happening over the next 2 to 3 years down the road.
Ifeili, your brief final thoughts.
Yeah, I think convergence also. China has, you know, 1 billion TV viewers, and 400 million internet users, and then 800 million mobile users. And I remember what Aurora said this morning, you know, TV terminals is almost the largest consumption terminal that's not yet connected to the web. So the convergence is a big word. In China now, the government is calling it 3-screen convergence, but I think it can be called multi-screen convergence, and that's very big.
Saad Mohseni with the movie.
Well, I think from an old media perspective, I still think that there are enormous opportunities in this region, in this neighborhood. Coming off a very low base, we see the ad markets in the 5 or 6 countries we're involved in, we're about to get involved in, growing at 20 or 30% per annum. And I think that it's a very aspirational, younger generation that we're dealing with. And I think it's very exciting to be in this region. I'm sure telecommunications and new media will prosper, but even old media, there's an enormous opportunity in that area as well.
Mr. Vestberg.
A couple of things are important. First of all, I think the focus on broadband quality will be increasing because we will demand it. I think that we will see a proliferation of devices that we never thought about. I mean, tablets and phones, smartphones coming down in price, penetrating more. And finally, we're going to see much more tiered pricing on broadband because we're going to see users that can only afford $1 prepaid. And we're going to see, I would say, firefighters that needs live streaming from a fire that needs to pay much more. So I'm going to see, those 3 things I'm going to see in the next couple of years.
Mr. Vollmer with Booz & Company.
Yeah, I think for me, the real word is to focus on innovation, whether it's on business model innovation or on user experience innovation. I think that from all that we've heard over the last day or so, whether it was the opening discussion with Jim Cameron or the other discussions about what's happening in digital media and entertainment, it's really about creating something that's unique and differentiated. And when everyone's in each other's business, more or less, you got to have something that's really going to get consumer attention and get it disproportionately.
Okay. And Mr. Zenstrom with the Tomco, your final thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So since we talked here about convergence and so forth, I think one thing what's important to realize is that it's very, very important that there's the broadband network is being continuously built out. It's very important that fixed broadband is being upgraded to fiber to the home. So I'm very pleased to hear that it's reaching 100% penetration here. That's a true enabler. And that's something we need to see all around the world, because when you have that, you can provide really more innovative services. It was also very important that we continue to build out the wireless networks, whether that's LTE combined with Wi-Fi, and so you can really get good broadband. And of course, that you're going to see continuous price reductions on smartphones, which are still very expensive. And as you have that, and then I think it's critical that on top of that, you have all these innovative companies which are providing online services, online content, communication services, and entertainment on top of that. That's where you need to have a global innovation flourish. And that's, in my mind, that's always going to be best by innovative startup companies. That's something that telcos is never going to be good at, never been good at it. But what they should do is they should focus on the broadband network. And I truly think that they can differentiate prices, because today more than ever, our lives depend on our broadband connection, whether they're fixed or mobile. So this Generation C, they're not going to accept that their network is down. So I think they're going to be willing to pay more part of the disposable income to have reliable online connection.
Yeah, from the hardware to the software to the ideas, it's a fascinating time for media and technology. This group will be leading the way. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.